Some fortunes are inherited. Some are stumbled upon. And then there are the rare ones, the kind built brick by brick from nothing, from borrowed time and borrowed hope, from the kind of hunger that only comes when you have truly had nothing. Gene Autry was that rare kind. He started with $8 saved from baling hay under a Texas sun, a Sears Roebuck guitar, and a voice that nobody had asked for yet. By the time he drew his last breath on October 2, 1998, he had turned that $8 into a fortune so vast that Forbes magazine counted him among the 400 richest Americans alive. A baseball team, television stations, radio empires stretching up the West Coast, real estate, oil wells, hotels. A name so famous it had not one, not two, but 5 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. One for every category of entertainment that ever existed. Nobody else in history has matched that record. Not before him, and not since. But here is the part of the story that most people never think about. When a man builds that much, someone has to carry it forward. Someone has to decide what it means, where it goes, and whose hands it lands in. For most dynasties, that answer is simple. Children inherit. Grandchildren squabble. Family names live on. Gene Autry had none of that. No children. No grandchildren. No bloodline waiting in the wings. And so, 28 years after his death, the question his fortune left behind is still echoing. What happened to everything he built? What does the Autry name mean now? And who, exactly, is the family that carries it? Before we can understand what happened after Gene Autry was gone, we have to understand what he actually was while he was here. Because the singing cowboy image, the white hat, the trusty horse champion, the wholesome grin, was real enough on screen, but it was only the surface of something far more complicated underneath. Autry was born Orvon Grover Autry in 1907 in rural Texas, the son of a horse trader who was often absent and a mother who was often ill. His childhood was a series of moves and near misses, of rented land and broken promises, of a father who eventually went to prison for bootlegging and left the family to fend for itself. By the time Gene was 6 years old, he was already working. By 12, he was saving every penny from backbreaking hay work to buy that famous guitar. By 17, he was a telegraph operator earning $30 a month and sending money home because there was nobody else to do it. The guitar and what he did with it changed everything. A chance encounter with the legendary Will Rogers, who heard the young telegraph operator singing in an empty depot and told him his voice belonged on the radio, planted a seed that never left him. He failed spectacularly the first time he tried New York. He came home broke and embarrassed. He went back to local dances and radio stations and kept singing anyway. That stubbornness is the thread that runs through everything he ever did. He simply refused to accept the version of his life that circumstances tried to hand him. By the 1930s, he was a genuine phenomenon. His song, That Silver-Haired Daddy of Mine, sold 500,000 copies in the middle of the Great Depression. Hollywood came calling. 93 feature films followed over 2 decades, along with a radio show that ran for hundreds of episodes and a television series that he produced himself so he could keep the profits. When studios tried to control him, he sued. When they replaced him with Roy Rogers, he rebuilt. When World War II came, he enlisted at the maximum draft age of 35 and flew dangerous cargo missions over the Himalayas rather than take the comfortable public relations role that other stars accepted. Every time the world tried to put a ceiling on Gene Autry, he found a way to go through it. And then came the business empire that most of his fans never fully knew about. The radio stations. The television stations, including KTLA in Los Angeles, which he bought from Paramount Pictures in 1964 for $12 million and sold in 1982 for $245 million. The Los Angeles Angels baseball franchise, which he won in 1960 and owned for decades. Real estate, hotels, oil interests, and investments that quietly accumulated while the public was watching his movies and singing along to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. By the time he died, estimates of his fortune ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Some accounts placed it even higher. The The boy who once saved $8 had become one of the wealthiest entertainers America had ever produced. None of it came with a simple plan for what happened next. And that reality starts with the two women who shared his life, and the one thing both marriages had in common. His first wife was Ina Mae Spivey, a 21-year-old aspiring music teacher from Oklahoma whom he met through his friend Jimmy Long in early 1932. They eloped in St. Louis on April 1st of that same year, April Fool's Day, and when the news reached her family at dinner that night, nobody believed it was real. But it was real, and it lasted nearly 48 years. Ina was not just a quiet presence in the background. She pushed him toward Hollywood in 1934 when he hesitated. She encouraged him to record Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in 1949 when he doubted whether a novelty Christmas song was worth his time. That one decision alone added enormously to his wealth and cemented a piece of his legacy that has outlasted almost everything else. She was, by most accounts of those who knew them, the steady hand behind a great deal of what he accomplished. They had no children. That fact, quiet and private for decades, would eventually shape everything that followed his death. When Ina died of cancer on May 19, 1980, Autry was 72 years old and, by multiple accounts, completely shattered. He withdrew from public life. The loneliness that settled over him was visible to everyone around him. Here was a man who had fought studios and flown over the Himalayas and built a broadcasting empire, and grief left him hollowed out in a way that none of those battles ever had. Then, just 14 months later, he stunned the public again. On July 19, 1981, he married Jacqueline Elam in a church ceremony in Burbank. He was 73. She was 39. The 34-year age gap made headlines immediately, and the questions that followed were exactly what you would expect. Who was she? How long had they known each other? What did this mean for his estate? Jackie Elam was not a stranger to him or to his world. They had first met in 1964 at a bank in Palm Springs where she worked, eventually rising from switchboard operator to vice president by her early 30s. Their first real date had come around New Year's Eve of 1979 to 1980, not long before Ina's death, and even then Autry had been so nervous that he invited her with a +1 because he did not know how to simply ask someone out. They married quietly, lived carefully, and drew no more attention to their private life than they had to. They had no children either. And so, when Gene Autry died in October of 1998, he left behind an enormous fortune, a towering legacy, and not a single direct heir in the traditional sense. No son or daughter to fight over the estate. No grandchildren to carry the name into another generation. Just a widow, a foundation, and a set of decisions that would determine what the Autry name would mean going forward. 28 years after his death, Jackie Autry remains the central figure in understanding what happened to everything Gene built. She did not disappear quietly into private life. She stepped into the role of guardian of his legacy with a seriousness and determination that surprised some people who had initially underestimated her. The most visible result of that stewardship is the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles. The museum had been Gene's passion project during his later years, an institution he funded and championed because he believed the history of the American West deserved a permanent, serious home. Under Jackie's leadership after his death, the museum did not simply survive. It grew. It merged with the Southwest Museum of the American Indian in 2003, expanding its collection and its reach significantly. Today, it holds one of the most important collections of Western American art, history, and culture in the world, with hundreds of thousands of objects spanning Native American heritage, frontier history, cowboy culture, and the mythology of the West as it was shaped by Hollywood. Jackie served as chair of the museum's board and remained deeply involved in its direction and funding for years after Gene's passing. The Autry Foundation, which channels resources into the museum and related educational programs, has continued operating with a mission that Gene himself defined: to explore and preserve the heritage of the American West in all its complexity, including the parts that the old singing cowboy movies never showed. The baseball story also continued beyond his death in ways that Gene himself set in motion. In the mid-1990s, He sold a portion of the Los Angeles Angels to the Walt Disney Company, a transaction that was always understood as a step toward a full transfer of the franchise. After his death, Disney completed the purchase of the team. The Angels went on to win the World Series in 2002, 4 years after Autry died, and fans remembered his decades of devotion to the franchise. There was something bittersweet about it. The man who had owned the team longer than anyone else never got to see them win it all. But the legacy of his ownership, of a man who cared genuinely about the team rather than simply the investment, was part of how people remembered that championship. What Autry's story reveals, when you look at it honestly, is how rare and how strange it is for a fortune of that magnitude to exist without a family structure to absorb it. Most great American wealth stories follow a predictable pattern. The founder builds. The children inherit and either preserve or squander. The grandchildren either restore the name or watch it dissolve. Gene Autry's story skips all of that entirely. There is no heir who grew up carrying the weight of the Autry name. There is no internal family drama over who controls the foundation or who speaks for the legacy. What there is instead is an institution, a museum, a foundation, a set of values that Gene himself tried to articulate through his famous cowboy code, a list of principles he promoted for children that emphasized honesty, respect, hard work, and kindness. Whether his private life always matched those principles is a more complicated question. Stories circulated after his death about a long affair with Gail Davis, the actress who starred in the Annie Oakley television series, during his marriage to Ina. The gap between the public code and the private man was real, and people who knew him acknowledged it. But the code itself, the public commitment to a set of values, shaped how he wanted to be remembered, and the museum carries that intention forward. 28 years after his death, the Autry name survives not through blood but through brick and mortar and institutional commitment. That is unusual. It is, in its own way, as unlikely as the rest of his story. The boy who saved $8 from hay baling eventually gave tens of millions of dollars to a museum that now educates hundreds of thousands of visitors every year about the history he loved. The singing cowboy who never had children left behind something that outlasts any dynasty a child could have built.